Hey everybody, I hope you're doing well. I'm going to break this lecture into two parts. The first one is on gender identity and gender ideology and how the differences by political party around identity and gender ideology, how they might be playing a role in the 2024 election. I especially focus on the gender gap and how it appears to be greater among young adults, and I provide a couple explanations for that. One is that young adult males are becoming more conservative, but the evidence fits more the idea that young adult females are becoming more liberal, and I provide some evidence on that and talk about that. I talk about both of those. I think they're both valid ideas, but I think there's more evidence for the second one. And then I bring in the idea of gender ideology, and I show that it's actually quite a bit more influential politically than gender identity. So that's something to think about as well. Then I ask a very tough question. It's tough for me at least to ask this, is why is the Trump campaign relying so much on lies, conspiracies, and misinformation? Um, and after talking about that a little bit, I pretty quickly moved to asking the question about the big lie, about the idea that Trump has held on to and so many Republicans, around 2 out of 3 Republicans, 3 out of 5 or 2 out of 3 Republicans hold to the big lie that the 2020 election was stolen. So I moved to asking, why do so many Republicans continue to believe the big lie? And I look at a variety of things, including media influence in disseminating the big lie. Talk a little bit about that, and if it asks the question, is the big lie tied to a core Republican identity? And I explain that idea a little bit, which I think a lot of people think something like that is happening. Then I ask the question of that I'll explain and answer around moral flexibility or sincerity of these beliefs. How sincere are these beliefs, or how much is it, just reflecting identities or allegiances, and that people then perform on surveys. But then I get around to a few other more detailed explanations. The failure of Republican leadership, which is one that I put a lot of weight in. Media polarization and distrust that we've looked at before, and think about how that might be leading us to a situation where so many Republicans continue to believe the big lie. And then but also then the narrative that Trump has developed and performed of Trump as victim, who's being victimized for standing up for the real Americans. And that's an effort to understand the strong emotional connection that many of Trump's supporters have with him. So that's it. Let's jump right in and look at the gender gap. There's been a lot of talk about a gender gap and in this election, and asking and kind of implying that the gender gap is growing, and maybe especially focusing on how the gender gap is growing between men and women that are young adults, 18 to 29-year-olds. So I want to take a look at the best data that I could find on this, and to present things a little differently than a lot of the stories I've seen. Um, in general, I would say that there's something really potentially going on among 18 to 29-year-olds, but I think that the focus on the gender gap may be somewhat exaggerated and maybe even a little bit sensationalized. So let's take a look at this chart here. It's got a lot of information in it. Some of it I'm not really focusing on. Focus on the blue part, because this chart is trying to show changes between August and September, and you're welcome to look at those, but that's not what I'm focusing on as much. But here's how this method of measuring the gender gap is. It's looking at the percentage of women who plan to vote for Harris minus the percentage of men who plan to vote for Harris. There's other ways of measuring it. This is how they measure it, and then I'm going to kind of follow that in a couple of other slides. The reason I wanted to show this to you is because it indicates that the gender gap is not as large as other kinds of what we could call social structural gaps. And I want you to be aware of that because, you know, sometimes the news can make it seem like men and women are polarized. Keep in mind that we talked earlier on about how the media in elections like sensationalist kinds of stuff as a general rule, and that polarization is gets eyes, it gets people to look at and attracts people. So if we look at the averages, this is from 538, and they do a good job of taking polling information from a lot of different polls and weighting them based on the quality of the methodology and then averaging them. And so this is looking at the average of polls in September. This story was just released a few days ago. We can see that the gender gap is 8.6%. 55.2 minus 46.6. That's significant. That's real, and you would, you know, as sociologists, we want to understand why that is. But also, we would want to look at what some of the other social structural gaps are. If we look at the blacks minus whites gap, it's 37%. If we look at the Latinos minus whites, it's 13%. In other words, that blacks are 30 percentage points more likely to vote for Harris than whites are. And you can see it's graphically shown there, right? And Latinos are 13% percentage points more likely to vote for Harris than whites are. So the racial gap is larger, it's substantially larger. In fact, these polls may be underestimating those gaps because, as I note there, polls that are conducted focusing on African American and Latino voters, where they work harder at reaching out to African American Latino voters, find significantly larger racial gaps. But either way, the racial gaps are greater than the gender gap, and I apologize, they're not bringing in Asian American or Native American, presumably because in these tables, presumably because the sample of Asian American and Native American are perhaps not large enough, even when you collate the polls, that they don't have a lot of confidence in the results. In addition, the social class gap, they're measuring it, and I've talked about this before. There's this divide between college graduates and non-college graduates, and for some reason, in ways that I don't agree with. I think that they should be breaking it down by race more generally. If you're going to focus on whites, you shouldn't just focus on whites because there's important patterns there. But just to go along with it, the race class, focusing on whites, class gap is quite large, almost 21%. Similarly, the urban-rural gap, which is also a racial gap, is tends to be a racial gap. Not trying to say all rural people are white, but there's that tendency, okay, is also quite large, 20%. And even the age gap, the young versus the old, is greater than the gender gap. Now, let's focus in on the 18 to 29-year-olds, keeping in mind that it was around an 8 to 9% gap overall. This comes from the Harvard Youth Poll, which was done in August. So it's not a perfect comparison to that group of September polls that we were just focusing on. But it did have a quite large sample. So it's only surveying young adults, 18 to 29-year-olds, and it's only looking at the likely voters. And here we can see a gender gap that is almost double for this age group, 70% to 53%. So that is a bigger gender gap, and it does look like the gender gap is bigger among the young adults. However, when all you do is say that look how big the gender gap is, you may not be really giving enough of the full picture, because look at the men and women independently, and we can see that both men and women are substantially more likely to support Harris than Trump. 53% to 36% among the men, and 70 to 23% among the women. So kind of how I would put it is that we need to also keep in mind that younger voters, young adult voters, both men and women are much more likely, substantially more likely to support Harris than Trump. And that what stands out, perhaps, and we'll come back to this, is that young adult women are much more inclined than to vote for Harris than many other demographic groups or social structural groups. Let's look at this question: why is the gender gap greater among younger voters? I'm going to be giving you two general answers. Young men are becoming more conservative and young women are becoming more liberal, right? It could be happening on either side there. Uh, and I'm going to suggest at the end to, spoiler alert, that the evidence seems to fit more at this time that it's more that women are becoming more liberal, and we'll look at that briefly as well. There's no way for me to completely unpack this, and so this is going to be a summary of a set of arguments that that are contested. But here I'm going to try and do my best job to sort of give that summary, and then I hopefully will raise questions about it. One argument is that there's a crisis in masculinity that's concentrated among young adult males, and that this has become almost like a cultural trope or a stereotype in our society, where we have these images of young adult males that are 28 years old, still living in their parents' home and playing video games all day long, and they're not getting or surfing the web or whatever, and they're not working, they're not making progress in their education and that kind of thing. That is not a gender gap there, as near as I can tell, is not well founded. That, for example, if you look at 18 to 24-year-olds who are not in school or not working, it's gender equal. That it's actually 13% of both men and women in that age group are neither going to school or working, right? That kind of pattern would be the one that would fit that stereotype of young men. I'm not saying that there isn't anything to that, but I do think we need to recognize that we may be dealing with a cultural stereotype there and perhaps ask why that stereotype exists. Uh, but at any rate, in this perspective, the crisis of masculinity has different dimensions to it, but one of those dimensions is what we could call ideological, or looking at the gender ideology. That we as a society, as we've moved in a more egalitarian direction, that this has in required that that both men and women develop more of an egalitarian gender ideology. The idea that that both men and women should be able to pursue their professional and work goals. Both should contribute equally in their families and raising children if they have children. These kinds of ideas, and that this has required men to give up traditional roles in ways that are difficult because the traditional masculinity, or at least elements of that traditional masculine culture, are still very much operating in pre-adolescence and adolescence and young adulthood, and so it creates a tension where on the one hand, focusing on young men, they tend to be quite gender egalitarian, more gender egalitarian in their ideology than older men, but they're also they often feel conflicted that they don't want to give up that traditional masculinity in some way, or they see that as in some sense related to them giving up power, for example. So that's one way of thinking about the crisis of masculinity. Another way of looking at it is to look at some growing gender gaps that indicate that young men are struggling, and that men in general are struggling, and some of this struggle may be concentrated on young adult males. And the way that I put it there is that there's little institutional concern for growing gender gaps indicating men are struggling. There's an argument that I think is very much worth listening to, that as we have moved in the direction of greater gender equality, there have been organizations formed that are kind of looking out for women. And their viewpoints, their frames have been institutionalized in our governmental organizations, in our educational organizations, and that this has in our schools and whatnot, and that this, in some sense, there's kind of advocates. It's not saying that we're gender equal in terms of, who's running our corporation and things like that, who's leading in many of the professions, those kinds of things. Clearly, the highly educated men still have an advantage over the highly educated women. A good amount of that is related to the cost that women pay when they have children in their professions. That's a separate issue. But or I don't want to separate it too much, but what I want to focus on instead, or what people like this, who are making this argument, want to focus on instead, is that there aren't really organizations that are out there advocating for men as much. There are some, and so I think they may be exaggerating this. But nevertheless, hear out the argument. For example, young men and boys have lower high school graduation rates. That's significant. Then they're less likely to attend college, those who do graduate, and then those who attend college are less likely to have a college degree after 6 years. And if you add all these things up, then there's about a 15 percentage point gender gap, where the percentage of women who have a college degree of this younger age groups, right? Not the older ones where men dominated the college. They're starting to pass away now. But among the younger age groups, there's about a 15 percentage point difference. We can see it at Cal State East Bay, where uh, um, I think the last time I looked, it could be different now, but the last time I looked, it's about 60% of the students at East Bay are female and 40% are male. That's a gender gap. That people that are focusing on this crisis of masculinity say, hey, we should be focusing more on that. But their perception is we're not really focusing very much on that. And they want, and so what this may do is it may mean that men who are experiencing this gender gap will look for go elsewhere to look for explanations. If the institutions are not recognizing this concern or this issue and responding to it by trying to figure out how to increase, high school graduation, et cetera, then then that it you can end up with a situation where people who are experiencing sort of falling behind looking for other explanations if they're or looking for other ways to address this. I really want to emphasize that this education gender gap is is considerably greater among working class African American and Latino men. So that's an important element of this as well. If we look at men more generally, their men are almost 4 times more likely than women to die of suicide, and over 2.5 times more likely to die of deaths of despair, suicide, drug overdose, or alcoholism. There's a lot of different possible explanations for these, but what this is focusing on is that there's a crisis that is gendered, that it's hitting men more, but we may as a society, because we've been focusing more on sort of facilitating greater gender equality, we may not be as well geared towards responding to a lot of the struggles that men and especially young men are facing. There is I have noticed a good amount of research and also a lot of news articles, even in this campaign, that are focusing on how working class, Latino, and African American young men are feeling neglected, not recognized, their problems, their issues not recognized, and their lives feeling destructured, that they're feeling, you know, more aimless and less, having less purpose in life. There's a tendency and for liberals, and maybe especially liberal intellectuals, to when they look at these gender gaps, to blame toxic masculinity. That there's a kind of a hypermasculine culture that's derailing men, and that this is what the problem is. But the people who say that the crisis of masculinity is real and should be responded to, they argue that when you blame it on toxic masculinity, that number one, you're not recognizing how much young men are more gender egalitarian, and not to deny that there is some toxic masculinity, but you're kind of misrepresenting things. And also, furthermore, isn't this kind of like a culture of poverty argument where you blame the victim? And they focus or they point out that typically when groups, like we saw the conservative racial ideology, when they want to blame the group that is being discriminated against or is struggling, they'll come up with a cultural explanation. Oh, it's a culture of poverty. And they say that the liberals are essentially doing what the conservatives are doing with regard to gender. You kind of blame it on toxic masculinity. And that allows you to have a cultural explanation where you say, you know what, the boys just need to give up their macho stuff, right? And you have a cultural explanation instead of addressing structural issues, and really investigating it and looking more closely at it. Um, some of these same people have raised the possibility that it's harder to achieve adulthood for boys than for girls. And they even go as far sometimes to say that this looks like it happens in a lot of different cultures. That in fact, if the anthropologists have for some time pointed out that that the kind of rituals of manhood, of achieving manhood, are um, uh, are much more focused on, where it's kind of like the idea in many cultures is that women just sort of naturally take up their roles and move into adulthood, whereas it takes, special, testing and training and stuff like that. One could argue that an example of a ritual of manhood that exists in our culture, certainly when I was growing up, was through sports, and maybe especially through, more aggressive sports like football. But now what's happened is that women and girls are into sports, and so that's not really a gender differentiating ritual anymore. That it's that kind of thing that these people are asking us to look at, and to not automatically pin things on toxic masculinity. I don't really have time to go into a longer discussion of this, but nevertheless, this is the kind of thing that they would raise. Is it harder for boys to achieve masculine identities? Another way of looking at the same kind of crisis of masculinity is that there's a lot of young men that are, that end up kind of feeling that contradiction I was talking about earlier, where they feel torn between a traditional and an egalitarian one, right? And they're sort of searching to develop a masculinity, and that that's positive, but that is still gender differentiating in some ways. That it's a masculine one, whatever that. It could be redefined, but it's a way for them to achieve masculinity, and that some young men, and this is well documented, how many and how much it influences them is unclear, have turned to what people refer to as bro culture. And they're the two, biggest names that I'm familiar with, and I've looked at a little bit, are Jordan Peterson and Andrew Tate. And they're kind of, quite different in many ways. But one thing that they have in common is that there's a tendency, they have this pretty strong tendency to be kind of telling young men that they're being dominated by feminists, that feminism is part of a sort of left-wing cabal that is trying to take away, essentially trying to harm them, take something away. It's not about trying to increase women's opportunity. It's attacking you more, presenting it more that way. It's presenting it, I guess I would say, in a more polarizing way. So that may be one of the ways that young men are turning in a more conservative way, right? Tapping into bro culture. And we can see this in this campaign. It's not hard for you to find articles about Trump working hard to communicate and go on podcasts and YouTube shows and stuff like that, and what people have come to call the manoverse. People like Jake and Logan Paul and Aiden Ross, Theo Vaughn. There's a bunch of them. We saw it in the Republican convention, where we saw the Hulk tear his shirt off, and Dana White the UFC guy, Kid Rock, and just kind of, exalting the traditional masculinity, and Trump seems to be working to connect with that. And this could be, we don't know yet. It hasn't shown up in the polls particularly yet, but this could be part of a process of connecting young men and into a more traditional masculine culture, which is going to be connected pretty seamlessly to a more conservative politics as well. Finally, and related to this, I'm going to just mention it and be happy to talk to anybody who wants to, is that there's an ongoing conservative project. It's not a new thing at all to reconstruct the traditional family that the conservatives have for quite a while. It's gotten tamped down a little bit in recent years, but I believe it's making a comeback in part through J.D. Vance. Um, with working on a common theme of what we need to do, that our society is falling apart because we've lost the traditional heterosexual family where the man was the breadwinner and the woman focused, she might work too, but she's going to focus more on raising the children. The family is focused on around having children. You can see this a little bit. I'm guessing some of you saw some of the stuff on how J.D. Vance, his comments about childless women, uh, and that kind of thing, and that's that child, his focus on childlessness is definitely part of that. Negative views of people who don't have children is part of that conservative project to rebuild the traditional heterosexual family. In general, I would say that this was stronger in the past, but it is kind of making a comeback, especially among conservative intellectuals like J.D. Vance. Um, Along with this all of this kind of thing, I want to say that there's an affinity that Trump has cultivated over time, and I don't just mean when he's been a politician, with what I think you could call traditional masculine culture. His associations with the UFC, his, representing himself as a fighter, somebody who talks back to the libs, and maybe focusing for young males, the idea of Trump as engaging in transgression, in violating the norms, right? Young males, if I'm gonna, I don't want to stereotype, but there's a tendency for youth and maybe especially young males to like cultural figures that are transgressive. They're going against the norm. It's part of, I would argue, it's part of developing independence to some degree. This can get taken in very, kind of conservative directions, but it can get taken in more liberal directions as well. This focus on transgression. Trump is clearly a transgressive figure. He's somebody who has repeatedly broken, norms of, that politicians ought to tell the truth, for example. He kind of loves, and I think he's loved in part for the ways in which he's, sticking it to the libs and being this, anti-political correctness transgressive figure. I'm going to be a little briefer on the liberalization of women argument because in some ways I think it's much more straightforward. That there's been a gender gap in the past. It's not, as I've pointed out, as large as people oftentimes think, but that there's been an affinity between the Democratic Party and women for some time. It was the Democratic Party that, for example, supported going all the way back to the 70s and 80s, that supported the Equal Rights Amendment. The Democratic Party has focused much more than the Republicans have on pay equity and paid family leave and medical leave. These kinds of things that speak to the position of women in our more egalitarian society. But I think there's some recent things that have moved women in a more liberalized way, in a more liberal direction. Young adult women, and that they're in a certain way much more concrete than some of the discussion that I was focusing on men moving in a conservative way. One is the Me Too movement, which, it was around for a while, but it exploded, I believe, in 2017, and it focused on raising consciousness, on speaking out about sexual assault, about naming rape culture. It was very much a movement that was saying we're not going to take the sexual harassment anymore. That connected with a lot of women, young women, and it became, I think, a vehicle that had affinity with the Democratic Party, not least of which because Trump is famous as a misogynist, as someone who, sees women as sex objects. I'm pretty sure I don't need to detail all of this, but maybe especially looking at the surreptitious recordings of him talking about grabbing women in their genitals and how him as a famous person can, sexually assault and sexually harass women with impunity, right? And there was a kind of super misogynistic tone of that. And that, I think, uh, uh, you know, there were some people who tried to, some, including women, who sort of thought of it like in terms of boys will be boys, that's sort of how men are, that kind of thing. But there was a large number of women, and especially young women, who looked at that as with horror. And how could we elect this person? And I think that was a good amount of the energy. If you may recall, there were very large demonstrations around the time, that was called the Women's March, around the time that that Trump was right being sworn in as president, where under the name of the Women's March, there was a large number of people who were demonstrating against what Trump stood for, and the misogyny was a good part of that. But by that time, there were many other issues that were being focused on as well. Less noticed by some people, but definitely noticed by the political scientists, was that the Women's March and the concern about Trump's misogyny was a tremendous uh, trigger for political organizing by especially young women. You may know young women who got involved in politics who had not previously seen themselves as political, in part over this. And I don't want to put it as just young women, but I think there was a tendency for it to be the younger generation women that were more likely to get involved. There were definitely plenty of middle-aged women that got much more involved as well. But this sort of pattern of Trump's misogyny, the Women's March, and this wave of political organizing, I think, goes along with the greater liberalization of women. And then another one, perhaps the most important one at this point in time, but certainly building on the other two, is the Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization ruling by the U.S. Supreme Court, which undid the right to abortion and said that states can create their own laws on abortion. And so abortion, after having been what many people saw as a stable right, got taken away in many places. And there's much more to this, and I will be talking more about it at other times throughout the term. But I just want to mention it here as a very influential trigger for women moving in a more liberal direction. Um, and young women especially, because they're in the childbearing age. They're the ones who are more sexually active and tend to be more sexually experimental and are more likely to need to avail themselves of abortion services. Uh, I would then kind of add to this that these three patterns, and we could probably talk about some other ones as well, were led to strengthening a pre-existing affinity between women and the Democratic Party. And I've mentioned earlier how pay equity has been equal pay for equal work, has been an important democratic principle for a long time, along with an emphasis on paid family and medical leave, one of the main sort of family policies that Harris is trying to expand, for example. But also the Democratic Party's uh, uh, long-standing focus on supporting caregivers, partly through things like increasing the minimum wage, right? Because oftentimes caregivers are among the lowest paid employees in the United States. And so by raising the minimum wage. But this support for caregivers is an important thing as well. And there's others. My point here is that there's this existing affinity and that these three other developments sort of contributed to that. So if this was the case, then we would expect if Me Too and Trump, you know, sort of takes power in 2017, that they sort of come on the scene in a big way, then we would expect the liberalization of women to be increasing in that, right around that period of time. So let's take a look and see what happens. I think this chart helps us begin to answer the question, and it's one of the reasons why I say that the change has been more women moving in a more liberal direction, and not so much about men moving in a more conservative direction. It's not a perfect chart for answering that. I couldn't find a perfect one, but what this is done by the Gallup organization. They use high quality methods in most of their surveys. And so what it does, if you kind of look at it, it breaks women and men into 18 to 29-year-olds and to 30 and older. What it and it then looks at them in three different time periods where they're getting the averages of polls between 2001 to 2007, 2008 to 2016, and more recently 2017 to 2024. And notice that 2017 to 2024 matches with the emergence of Donald Trump and the Me Too movement. And what we see here is that if I'm going to focus on, again, since this is what we're focusing on the 18 to 29-year-olds, you can see that women in 2001 to 2007 identified as liberal or very liberal 28% of women. They don't put the numbers on it, but that's what that dot represents for women. It's 28% in 2001 to 2007. That goes up to 32% between 2008 and 2016, and it goes all the way up to 40%, an 8 percentage point increase between 2017 and 2024. So we can see both a longer range trend of women becoming more liberal that was clearly happening to some degree before 2017, but you can see the slope gets greater once you get to moving towards the 2017, that there's that 8 percentage point increase. So that fits the idea that young adult women are becoming more liberal, at least in their identification, where they're saying, yeah, I'm a liberal, or I consider myself very liberal, one of the two. Then if we compare the men, it looks almost more flat, but you can make a little bit of a case that that there's a slight declining liberalism among the men. And the reason why I say this table's not perfect is because I would prefer actually to be looking at men and women on the conservative ideology as well. But I think this is good enough and it serves our purposes well enough. And I'm going to show you another table that adds more information in the next slide. But what we see here for the men is that in 2001 to 2006, it's 25% identified as liberal or very liberal. In 2008 to 2016, it was 27%. This is in the Obama era. So maybe they were becoming a little more liberal. And now after that, they're back down to 25%. So it's not exactly level, but it's fairly level. And that clearly the pattern here is that it's not so much that the men are changing, it's that the women are becoming more liberal. This chart shifts our focus from whether someone identifies as liberal or very liberal, or I would say it shifts our focus from political ideology, liberal versus conservative, to issue positions. And here we get a little bit different picture. What we saw in the last slide was that men were becoming, in terms of how they identified their political ideology, were becoming a little less liberal between 2008 and 2016 compared to 2017 to 2024. Keep in mind that what Gallup has done is they've averaged polls asking these same questions at different periods in these two different periods of time. We could call the 2008 to 2016 the Obama era, and to the 2017 to 2024, the Trump-Biden era. So what we already saw is that women's political ideology identifying as liberal or very liberal, that increased 8 percentage points between those two time periods. We just saw that. And men's went down 2 percentage points. That kind of fits the idea that that men are becoming maybe more conservative, or certainly less liberal. However, when you look at the issue positions, which this slide focuses on, you get a different picture. The women, what it's looking at again is changes in the direction. Each of these are liberal issue positions. If everything from you think marijuana use should be legal, that's a more liberal position, to you identify as pro-choice on abortion, that's a liberal identity, to you think immigration levels should be increased, that's a liberal belief as well, or that you approve of labor unions. And all of these are liberal positions. And it's looking at the changes for women. Have they moved? How much they've moved? And if you look at this chart here, looking at the women 18 to 29, on all the issue positions, they've moved in the liberal direction at least a little bit. The least, down at the bottom there, favor law banning possession of handguns. They are only 3 percentage points more likely to support that view. With the most is global warming caused by pollution from human activities. 20 percentage points more likely to agree with that statement, that global warming is caused by pollution from human activities, that it's not just some natural development, it's human influenced. In fact, we can see that the biggest changes, if you look at the top three, they're ranked, right? According to how much women have changed. The biggest three are all around the environment. So this focuses on how women have become more liberal around the environment. But they've also become more liberal across a variety. Young adult women have become more liberal across a variety of positions. 24 different questions that they asked, they became liberal on all of those. Looking at the men, it's a little more complicated, but actually what we see is that there are many more issues that men have become more liberal over between these two time period, between the Obama era and the Trump Biden era. Men have become more liberal on, if you were to add those up, my count is 17 out of the 24 positions. And how I figured this was that the ones that were only 1 percentage point difference, I had said that's so negligible that I'm going to count that as zero. So of those that were 2 percentage points, which there was one of, or more change, I would say that my count was that there are 17 of the 24 issues men have moved in a more, young adult men have moved in a more liberal position. Whereas there's 5 that I would say there's no change on. Those are ones that there's 0 or 1%. And there's 2 where there is men have moved away from a liberal position. The 2 are the belief that upper income people pay too little in taxes. They're about 5 percentage points less likely to believe that. And the other one is that they favor a law banning possession of handguns. They're about 3 percentage points less likely to agree with that. But overall, we can see that the way I would summarize it is that across a broad range of issue positions, doesn't cover all of them, but it's a broad range, women have moved in a liberal direction on all of them, and men have moved in a liberal direction. Not as much as women in many of them, but they've moved in a liberal direction on the majority, on a strong majority of the issues. And they've only moved away from the liberal, declined in liberal position taking on 2 of the 24. I do also want to note that a couple where men have moved in a more liberal direction than women. One is that they've become more liberal. They're not more liberal than women, but they've made more change in a liberal direction around the idea that same-sex marriage should be legal. And let's see, there was another one. Oh, there's one that it's not more than, but it's equal to. They're equally likely to say that they have sympathies more with the Palestinians than Israelis. In other words, both men and women have equally moved on that issue in a more liberal direction. So, summarize, women have moved in a more liberal direction across the board. Men have moved in a more liberal direction when you're looking at issue positions. Young adult men have moved in a more liberal direction across a strong majority of issue positions, and moved away from a more liberal position, declined in the liberal position on only 2 out of the 24 issues. Now I want to wrap things up for this week on gender. What I want to do is I want to focus on this statement here. We've looked at gender differences in terms of, men and women. That's gender identity. But I think that if we really want to understand the role of gender in politics, it's probably more important to look at gender ideology, or certainly at least as important. It's more influential, I guess I could say. So the statement I would make, and that I'm going to show you in a table here in a minute, is that gender ideology is much more politically influential than gender identity. And in order to do this, to create the gender measure of gender ideology, it's not perfect, but it's a 2024 survey, and so it's recent enough that I think that it's valuable today. I created a two-item scale using the ANES 2024 pilot survey, which was done in early 2024. And it's a scale that some people label, I don't like this name, so I'm renaming it. They call it hostile sexism. There's a reason for that, but I prefer the phrase resentment towards women, and some other people would refer to it as a gender resentment scale. It's only a two-item scale. I could have used a broader scale, but it would bring in other dimensions. The results of it would be almost identical, would be very little different. So this two-item scale is perfectly fine. It has two statements that people are asked to agree with or disagree with. The first one is, many women interpret innocent remarks or acts as being sexist. I take that to be people saying women are too touchy around issues of sexual harassment and sexual assault these days, right? They've gone too much in the direction of being touchy about that. That is indicating a kind of resentment towards women, that your concern with sexual assault, with sexual harassment is unwarranted in essence, okay? Then the other one is a more general one, but it has to do with power and thinking about how things have gone. We've had increasing gender equality, but this frames that increasing gender equality as women seek to gain power by getting control over men. So it's framing gender equality, this trend that we've all experienced in various ways, as not women wanting equal opportunity and things like that. It's framing it as women are trying to get power over men. Another statement that I think fits the idea of resentment towards women. You could also say resentment towards women's rights or something along those lines. Okay? So what I did was I created a two-item scale, and then I broke that into more or less equal thirds. The lower end, low on resentment towards women, medium on resentment towards women, and high on resentment towards women. And here's what you get when you compare that to a presidential vote. Let's take a look. Now, this is planned presidential vote. Remember, this survey was done in early 2024, so the thought was it was going to be Biden versus Trump at that point, which it was for a little while before Biden dropped out. Now I want you to recall that the gender gap was around 8.6%, right? And even the young adult gender gap was 17 percentage points. But if we look at the gender ideology gap, it's 42 percentage points, a much greater gender gap. In other words, the difference between support for Biden and Trump or Democrats and Republicans is not so much whether you're a male or a female, that plays a role, certainly. Not trying to completely minimize that, but that what really with regard to gender, what really matters a lot is what your beliefs are around, the greater equalization of women. And so what we see here is that, and the reason why I said that that was a 42% gender ideology gap is that if you subtract women that have, excuse me, these are men and women. Let me be clear about this. This includes men and women, and I could break it down by gender, and you would see that the pattern was very much the same across gender identity. But if you look at people that had low resentment, 73% of them said they were going to vote for Biden. If you look for people that had high resentment towards women, then it's only 32%. That's a 42 percentage point gap, which I would label that gender ideology gap. You could flip it around and do it the other way. People who had low resentment were 27% were likely to vote for Trump, and 69% of those with high resentment. And so if you subtract 27 from 69, you also get a 42% gender ideology gap. This question here is a tough one for me to raise, but based on just paying a lot of attention to what's going on in the campaigns and doing some fact checking and tracking down patterns from research into recent campaigns and things like that. It's a question that keeps coming up for me. It's difficult for me because I'm trying to not be biased. I'm trying to limit whatever biases I have as much as possible. But this is something, like I said, I feel I'm compelled to raise it. I raise it in the spirit of, wanting for those people who disagree with me to have reasoned dialogue with me. And I hope that you will, if you think that I'm wrong. And I can imagine some people who feel that I'm wrong on different directions, but especially those of you who are strong Trump supporters. There's a few things I want to say at the outset before I jump in and look specifically at the Trump campaign. First, it must be acknowledged that conspiracies and misinformation are generated on the left and the right. It's not conspiracies, misinformation are not just a Republican thing. They're also a Democratic thing, or there's a liberal thing as well. It happens on both sides. And as we've talked about before, slant or perspective is always present all the time. I do think that it matters. As you'll see, I do think that it matters a lot in terms of how much conspiracies and misinformation get spread within constituencies. I think it matters a lot what their media do, what the mainstream right-wing and left-wing media, how they act and perform, but maybe especially the political leaders on the left and the right. I think that in other words, it's the elites who influence things perhaps the most in my view. I'm kind of cutting to the chase a little bit to start with here. In addition, and relatedly, during campaigns, most politicians exaggerate and cherry pick information. Cherry picking as in, picking information that if you present it out of context, kind of creates a distortion. Most politicians exaggerate and cherry pick information to frame issues and problems in order to make these frames fit the information fit their policies and ideology. A couple of examples we saw in the debate. One was Harris said that Trump lost manufacturing jobs while Biden created 800,000 manufacturing jobs. That runs against Trump's entire framing of him being, the supporter of blue collar Americans and bringing manufacturing jobs back. Technically speaking, it was fairly accurate, but the reality is that Biden didn't create 800,000 jobs. It was less than that, 739,000. And also, the job losses that Harris focused on were because of COVID. That Biden, and if you were to look, if in a more balanced way, I think it's fair to say that if you were to look at their records on bringing, increasing manufacturing jobs, that they're about equal so far. And Harris could have argued that Biden, through the Chips and Technology program especially, and some of the Inflation Reduction Act stimulus as well, is in the process of creating more manufacturing jobs. In other words, there's a lot more manufacturing investment that's going on. But the characterization of Trump losing manufacturing jobs was inaccurate, although technically correct. That's what I mean by cherry picking. That's a really good example of exaggerating a little bit and cherry picking. Another one. Also at the debate, Harris said that Trump plans to cut taxes for billionaires and big corporations, adding $5 trillion to our deficit. There's some truth to this, but there's also some omission and some missing context. Part of the context is that $5 trillion deficit, that's over 10 years, right? So it's not nothing. That's 500 billion a year, but it's not on average. But it's not, when you just say 5 trillion, people, what's your context there? Another thing is that it wasn't only billionaires and big corporations who benefited from Trump's tax cuts. Did they disproportionately? Yes. I think that is accurate. Part of the 2017 tax cuts, which Harris is referring to how they get sunsetted or they go away in 2025, and Trump has said that he's going to keep one of the things he'll pass is to keep them going into the future, right? But the 2017 tax cuts, which Trump plans to preserve, did cut the corporate rate from 35% to 21%. There was a substantial tax cut for profitable corporations in that. So in that sense, the big corporations, many of them are profitable. That fits. However, when you look at the individual tax cuts, it's true that they were skewed to the wealthy, but it's also true that middle and lower income people also got tax cuts. Lower income people very little, middle income people a little more. So if we look at, you can go, I've linked it, and you can go look at the assessment by an objective third party. And what you'll see is that 23% of the cuts went to the top. If you look at all the tax money, 23% of those cuts went to the top 1% in terms of income, and 64% of the tax dollars cut went to the top 1/5 or the top 20%. So that is disproportionately going to the wealthy. However, it's also the case that almost 19% of the tax cuts went to the bottom 60% of taxpayers. And I think it was around 11 or 12% of that went to the middle quintile. So the people that are between 40 and 60% on the income scale. So it is also true, and she's omitting the fact that the tax cuts also went to a lesser extent in terms of amount of taxes, but they did go to the middle and lower income people too. Now, I want to raise in this context the idea of moral flexibility. And what I would say is that there would be a tendency for Harris supporters to say, that's not really a lie, even though there are clearly, or that's, or that's, or they might even go further and say that's accurate. Um, and what researchers have found is that people, and this is not just in politics, but it definitely plays a role in politics, is that people oftentimes, based on what their political positions are, will provide a bit of what you could call moral flexibility to it. That they're looking at it like she's really the deeper truth. Yeah, it's true that middle and lower income people got tax cuts, but the deeper truth, the more important truth, is that Trump's tax cuts go to the wealthy. And that's what she's trying to communicate, and that's accurate. Okay? So I want you to keep in mind this idea of moral flexibility. I also want you to keep in mind the fact that exaggeration and cherry picking happens on all sides. Um, One other thing before I move ahead is that I want to acknowledge that there is research, and I'd be happy to go over it with people, at least that which I'm aware of, that does indicate that there is a somewhat greater tendency to believe conspiracies on the right than on the left. I personally think that some people may exaggerate that to some extent. And one of the things I want to make clear is that both liberals and conservatives can be prone to believing conspiracies. And if I get a chance, I'm going to circle back at another week and talk more directly about conspiracy thinking. I'm not going to promise that because there's a lot of things we want to cover. But what I do want to, one sort of real simple thing to say that I think makes good common sense too, is that people believe conspiracies that align with their existing, in this case, political viewpoints. You know, so that's the conspiracies in some sense reflect the people's pre-exist the particulars of the conspiracies people believe reflect their political viewpoints oftentimes. Although there are people who have a tendency to believe conspiracies, and that's a somewhat different thing. I can get into that. If this is something you're really interested in me going into more depth on, I encourage you to contact me and we'll talk about it. I also there down at the bottom linked really good fact checking of the Trump-Harris debate. You can see a lot of the whoppers that Trump did, but also that many, you know, uh, lies and misinformation in poor context and that kind of thing on the Harris side as well. So if there is misinformation is part of political campaigns and especially cherry picking and that kind of thing, uh, there seems to me to be something qualitatively different about the Trump campaign. I'm not the only one who notices this, of course. I don't recall, with the possible exception of previous Trump campaigns, although I do believe he's taken it to another level in 2024. I don't recall seeing this level of lies and misinformation in previous elections. And here, when I think about the level of it, I'm thinking about the repeating of lies after they're debunked, the brazenness and the shamelessness of the lies, and then also using the lies to create an image of social chaos and steep decline. I'm going to just mention a few. I think that they all, are important. There's many others, especially if I was to go back in time. But I'm focusing on the ones that I'm seeing, that have been repeated quite a bit in this campaign. First one you're very familiar with. We looked at it earlier. Haitian immigrants eating their neighbors' pets. Think about the brazenness of that kind of lie. The repeated claim with no evidence supporting it of undocumented, and people repeatedly saying, hey, there's no evidence, but it still gets repeated that undocumented immigrants and asylees are coming from Latin American countries who are emptying their prisons and mental institutions. That essentially what we're getting is people, is other countries' prisoners and people who are mentally ill. More recently, Trump, I haven't seen the full thing, but Trump talked about them, the immigrants and having bad genes and raising the idea that our country has bad genes, very much from a fascist playbook, to be quite honest. He's repeatedly talked about how, said that violent crime has increased through the roof during the Biden administration. Based on various measures of violent crime, it rose at the end of the Trump administration, perhaps because of COVID, emptying out public spaces and making them more vulnerable, possibly also because of depolicing that may have happened and appears to have happened some places in response to the protests against police violence. The violent crime rose a little bit more, not as much as at the end of the Trump administration. It rose a little bit more in 2021, which was Biden's first year. But since then, murders and violent crime have both declined. So it's just not true, and it's false, and people have been pointing it out. Yet it fits that narrative of chaos and decline, as do the lies about undocumented immigrants as well. He's repeated the lie over and over again that legal scholars universally approved of him getting through, appointing 3 very conservative justices, getting Roe versus Wade overturned. He just asserts that this is the lie, that this is what legal scholars, all of them, liberal and conservative, said that we needed to do in order to get on the right footing. He has all kinds of false talking points about denying the human influence of climate change and calling it a hoax. Although I haven't seen him use the word hoax as much, it could be that I'm in this campaign, could be that I'm missing it. He's repeatedly stated, as has J.D. Vance, that Trump saved Obamacare. The opposite is true, or if he'd had his druthers, the opposite would be true. Trump tried to kill Obamacare. And then most recently, there's becoming a litany of false claims, saying that the Biden response to the terrible devastation from Hurricane Helene is has been too slow and meager and non-responsive and those kind of things. So this is obviously a partial list, but if you look at the depth of these kind of lies and the ways in which they they present an image of severe neglect and social chaos, I think we're talking about something qualitatively different. Of course, Trump's big lie is that the 2020 election was stolen from him. And that's I'm going to focus more on this big lie, and because partly because I think people have thought about it a little bit more. There's a little more research related to it, and also I think it kind of overshadows all the other lies and understanding. My goal is to try and understand why do so many Republicans believe the big lie, and I think that understanding that will help understand why people are putting up with all the other lies as well. This broader pattern of lying and relying on conspiracy theories. So why do so many Republicans believe the big lie? That's the question I set out to answer after I thought about it a little bit. This is going to be far from a complete answer. It's more just raising some ideas, and then I'm going to ask you what you think as well. I think it's important to just lay out the basic elements of Trump's big lie. The first one is that the election was stolen. Along with that is the idea that there's a technological conspiracy to rig the election. So the fact that there are voting machines and things like that were involved, this adds a layer of opacity to things. We've used that concept before, where if you got technology as opposed to paper ballots and things like that, that can add to a sense of it opens the door to conspiracy much more. Um, it works with the idea. Another element is that the investigators, the people who are looking into the integrity of the election, and the judges who I think it was around 63 different cases that were brought before judges, and since Trump and the Trump people lost all but one of them, and the one they won was quite minor. I think it involved just a couple hundred votes. That that the the big lie has to be that has to include that these investigators and judges, even though a considerable number were appointed by Trump himself, that they must be biased too. Okay, so they're either in on the conspiracy or there's something blinding them. This is an element of the big lie. Uh, Another thing is that I think is really important is that it portrays his big lie. If you listen to how he talks about it, the people who question the legitimacy of the 2020 election, they're not conspiracists. They're good citizens. They're people who are working to protect democracy. So consequently, the Trump supporters are even though many people who are not Trump supporters, independents and Democrats, are quite concerned that Trump is working to dismantle democracy. Trump supporters are also very concerned about democracy because they believe that the election was stolen, and that it's likely to happen again, and that the Trump supporters who believe the big lie, the election deniers among the Trump supporters, there's a couple of different studies that I've seen that show that they are considerably more concerned that we're going to end up in some kind of civil war, or that this is all going to end up being resolved through violence. And I think that what that indicates is how much many of them, maybe most of them, believe this part of the big lie, that they believe that they're being good citizens trying to protect democracy, even though the objective facts are the opposite of that. That by buying into the big lie, they're undermining democracy. This kind of stuff has a lot of ironies in it. Um, Another really important part of it, and I'm not sure if it's exactly right to call it an element of the big lie, but I put it here. It's definitely a piece of the reality of Trump's big lie, and that is that there's a pretty consistent pattern. People have looked at it, have been able to say, oh yeah, that conspiracy started over here, and then they mainstreamed it. The basic idea is that the conspiracies about, voting machines or ballots showing up and stuff like that, these are conspiracies that are fabricated in far right media, and then they get mainstreamed into mainstream conservative media and made the focus of the legal battle. So if you look at, one of the reasons why so many of them, of the cases, were thrown out, in some instances with hostility from the judges, is because they were so far-fetched and there was no evidence whatsoever to support them. And it's because they came from far-right conspiracies. But think about this for a second, and why I think ultimately I would call this an element of the big lie is that it takes the conspiracies from the far right and it legitimates them by saying we're going to fight legal battles over them. And then when those battles lose, then you can say, see, the judges are biased. Everybody's against us. There's a big conspiracy. And it allows that, the belief in the big lie to sort of all weave together. Or at least that's how I'm starting to think about it. So here's some survey data on the big lie, on believing in the big lie. And you can see it was a survey. It's mapping it so you can see the answers or the rates of believing in the big lie in 2021 and in 2023. So for example, among all Americans, among everybody, all adults, 29% believed the big lie in 2021, and that was actually up slightly to 32% in 2023. Among Republicans, it was 66% in 2021 and down slightly to 63% in 2023. Democrats are by comparison, are very unlikely to believe the big lie. It was 4% in 2021 and 6% in 2023. So there's a couple big takeaways that I want you to get from this. One is that obviously there are very stark party differences in believing the big lie. Actually, three things. The second thing that you should get is that there are substantial differences by religious affiliation, with white evangelical Protestants at around 60% in both years, and black Protestants at the lower end between 6 and 11%. And the next least likely to believe the big lie are the religiously unaffiliated, with 18 to 23%. So there are those differences by party identity and religion, which we would expect, but also it's also noteworthy that the changes have been minimal over time. So what I would want to emphasize is the persistence in the belief, the stability of the belief in the big lie. Which I think fits other things that we know, such as Trump argued for the big lie right from the beginning, and then while after taking a break after January 6th for a little while, he continued, once he was not impeached, he continued to sustain and promote that belief, as did his allies. So this is an effort to try to uh, summarize some of the research on the big lie. Um, I'm going to be honest, I've had a little bit, it's been a bit of a challenge, to sort of piece this together, because I think that there's a fair number of missing pieces. So this might seem a little scattershot, but let me go through a couple of things, and I think that we'll start to see some themes or some patterns that I think are certainly valuable to know, and that in the end, again, my goal is to understand what's the nature of this belief, and why so many Republicans hold this belief. Um, I just showed from the previous table that belief in the big lie is both persistent, it has stayed about the same, and it's widely held by Republicans. That tracks the fact that Trump, from the get-go, said that this was stolen, and although he laid low for a little while after January 6th, 2021, he always persisted in the idea with an occasional faltering. He's persisted in maintaining the big lie. There's research that shows that social media helps spread the big lie. The best report I've seen on that is linked there if you want to go take a look at that. I think that part of their overall argument is that it that the lack of regulation of social media contributed to the spread. I'm not going to go into that now. I think that there's important issues there to think about on different sides. People who most trust Fox News, and especially people who most trust other far-right media, the Fox News is mainstream media. It's to the pretty far right, but it's mainstream. But for other far-right media, 65% and 92% respectively are much more likely to believe the big lie than people who trust mainstream news outlets, who are most trusting of mainstream news outlets, which it's only about 14% of them. Another thing, you're going to read an article that kind of leans in this direction. There's been other people who've talked about this, and I think it's a valuable way to think about it, is that one of the things that's happened, it may be that the big lie is part of the Make America Great Again or Trump or Republican identity, that it's become almost compulsory. If you're a Trump supporter, of course you believe the big lie, right? That the two kind of go together. So there are some people that argue that the big lie is it's not so much a matter of truthfulness or factualness. It's more a matter of a social identity that's highly valued. So that's an important way of thinking about it. You can look at a couple quotes here that I think sort of fit or at least speak to this idea. For many of Trump's voters, the belief that the election was stolen is not a fully formed thought. It's more of an attitude or a tribal pose. And what she's saying, what the author's saying there when you say a tribal pose is, I take that to be, It's part of their identity as Republicans. They know something nefarious occurred. They're certain of that. And this gets, repeated in other ways that I'll talk about, but can't easily explain how or why. What's more, they're mystified and sometimes angry that other people don't feel the same. I think that quote, I'm not going to try and unpack all of it because I think it speaks to not only this idea that MAGA and Trump and Republican identities are tied closely to the big lie, but it speaks to a couple of other things as well. Um, Another thing that this other quote, which I think speaks maybe more to some things I talk about in future slides, is when you tell Trump voters that the election was stolen, some of them tally that, in other words, count that as evidence that it was stolen. So, the fact that people are telling them it wasn't stolen makes people believe even more that it was stolen. Almost as if whoever is telling them this must be part of the conspiracy. Um, so that another way of thinking about this, we can think about it in terms of allegiance, identity, Republican identity or Trump identity, Trump supporter identity. It could also be relatedly, a way of signaling their allegiance to Trump and the Republicans. Uh, um, and so that I think is maybe captured in that first quote a little bit as well. Uh, However, and this is important too, is that research indicates that people are sincere in their beliefs about the big lie. And researchers have come up with ways of sort of pushing people and motivating people, incentivizing people in surveys to sort of acknowledge, that something is either, whether something, well, it might not be really factual, but it kind of, that kind of moral flexibility kind of thing. And the people that I've seen that have tried to do this end up concluding that people are very sincere in these beliefs. So I don't think that it's just a matter of, oh, they're just signaling their allegiance. But I do think that it does connect to it is something that is, mandatory almost to be a Trump supporter and a Trumpian Republican at this point. Similarly, in the same way that there's this great sincerity in beliefs about the big lie, the moral flexibility argument doesn't fit very well. It doesn't, in other words, the Trump supporters don't say, well, it might not be true, but it really wasn't fair for the most part, they don't say it might not be exactly true. It wasn't really exactly stolen, but it was unfair. The Democrats let too many people vote through mail and stuff like that. That there's a what I my reading of the research is that that's not what how people look at it. That they really do believe that it was stolen. They may be unclear about how it was stolen, but they feel in their bones, there's a certainty that something unfair was done, even if they can't prove it. Even if their explanations, don't seem to hold a lot of water. So I think one of the, I've come to the tentative conclusion or hypothesis that one of the main reasons so many Republican voters uh, um, believe the big lie is because of a failure of Republican leadership. And I base this on that there's a very consistent, and it pops up in a lot of different ways in political science and political sociology, that voters rely a lot on trusted political elites. And here I include media elites for information and framing. I'm not saying that people aren't critical thinkers, and they are, but to a great extent, we all need shorthands. We all need ways to, where can I go to get good information, to orient myself to the, on this issue, or to decide who I should vote for in this particular election, right? So voters rely a lot on trusted political elites for information and for framing, to help create a perspective that fits with them. When Trump, who is a very influential political elite in the Republican Party, persistently tells big lies, and repeats the same big lie over and over again, his supporters are, strongly inclined to believe him, because he is somebody who trust him, oftentimes feeling like he was this outsider who came in and was going to really fight for them when the other two parties, didn't care about them at all, didn't care about their issues. So they've already got a pretty strong identification with him. And so when he tells this big lie, they're more quite inclined to believe him. But it's not just Trump, of course. Many Republicans believe the big lie because Republican leaders and elites have not stood up to Trump publicly, especially not in any sort of organized way. If you look, there's plenty of Republicans who say, "Oh my God, when I worked with him, it was awful. He's totally incompetent." These kinds of things. There are people saying this. It's not hard to find people that way. But what has happened is that they tend to come out individually, and then they end up getting ruined politically, right? And it would have taken it could have happened at different times. It could have happened when he was impeached after January 6th, where the Republican leadership got together and say, "Okay, we're done with this guy." A few of them said it, I'm done with him, or he'll get his, outside of the impeachment. But in general, what I would say is that they didn't come up in an organized way. They mostly worked at protecting their own interests, right? Because they didn't want to ruin themselves politically. And so there was a failure of nerve among the Republican leadership. And also, there has come to be, and this is something that I'm not going to explain in a lot of detail, but there's come to be a strong incentive that makes it so Republican politicians who perpetuate the lie, the big lie, are rewarded. So that more and more of the people, of the Republicans who are being elected into the House of Representatives, and to a lesser extent the Senate, are people who are openly running on the big lie in various ways, and that has that fits this kind of reward structure. Another factor that I'm not going to say much about, but I could I connect you to a Jane Meyer article that talks about this in some depth if you're interested, is that there's financial support for wealthy conservatives for projects supporting the big lie, often under the idea of election integrity. And this is something that, if I get more time, I'm going to circle back to, which is one reason I'm Not going to cover it more at this time. But if you, the thing that I would want to bring into this is that the conservative, as a summary, the conservative and the Republican establishment have been become, cowed by Trump, but also there have been also some very wealthy conservatives who see Trump as a positive vehicle, and so they've worked and some of them, not most of them, but some of them have worked at supporting the big lie with funding various projects which raise the idea that the election, the elections are all have all kinds of violations. A couple of other things that I think we should think about. We're kind of coming back to earlier issues in a certain way that we talked about earlier on, but they're very appropriate here. One is media polarization and the social structure of trust and mistrust. We already saw previously that conservatives tend not to use or trust the mainstream media. This makes it so the conservatives silo themselves more hermetically. They seal themselves off from alternative viewpoints more than Democrats do, although there's a good amount of siloing on both sides. Again, I'm not trying to make it just the conservatives do this, but it appears to be an objective fact in all the information I've seen, or almost all of it, that the conservatives seal themselves off so that they're in a kind of echo chamber that says the same thing. It's important to note that Trump, this was not new. The distrust of the mainstream media is not new with Trump, but Trump strengthened and amplified and expressed it with more hostility than previous Republican leaders. And just the phrase fake media, which he charges so frequently anytime there's any sort of reporting that he doesn't like, regardless of how accurate it is, his use of fake media he has used this to increase distrust of the mainstream media, and I think that's important. So you've got higher distrust of the mainstream media, and you've got people sealed off more from the mainstream media so that they're mostly going to be hearing people who are repeating the big lie in various ways, and if they're not repeating it, they're at least failing to challenge it. So people relying on the conservative echo chamber, one thing is that follows from this logically is that they don't hear or read straightforward debunking of Trump's lies. This is one reason why I think it's important to have very clear renderings of what actually happened. Not that I think you're going to change people's minds immediately, but just to expose people to what has actually happened and how much the Trump people tried to prove that the election was stolen with so little effect. I think that and there's a lot of people that don't hear that very often, and when they do, they can sort of easily dismiss whoever it is, because when they do encounter information debunking Trump's lies, it's almost always from media outlets or people who they see as part of the other, right? And so with that, they're the liberal media, they're the the fake news or whatever, if they're talking about the media, or they're in some other way, they're opponents. And so this allows them to use motivated reasoning, which helps them side with Trump, so that they can develop their own reasoning. You'll see examples of the motivated reasoning in the article you're reading. I want you to take note of those, because it's not, some of the things they raise, if if you if you don't look at if you if you don't look at the other information that's out there, then they're raising things that you can see how it's plausible to them, right? And look for the motivated reasoning in the article. That's just my tip, one of my tips for this week. Um, Motivated reasoning where you avoid the truth through reasoning processes, bringing in information and bringing in frames that justify your pre-existing beliefs so that you're able to experience that you're making sense of this and you're reasoning and you're actually really thinking about it and making a reasoned decision when in fact you're reasoning in a biased way that is just going to repeat what you already believe. So this leads to a situation. If I put these things together of the silo and the distrust for things outside the silo, then accurate information is mistrusted and trusted information is false. In addition to the failure of Republican leadership and the role that media siloing, media polarization, and political polarization have played in the large number of Republicans who've held to the big lie, I think we also want to think about or factor in or include the very strong emotional connection that many Trump supporters have with Trump. And I think that he has kind of woven in the big lie into one of the ways that he has built this strong connection. So here's how I'm going to describe it, and then I hope that you'll critique or offer alternative explanations. I think Trump has framed the big lie as him being victimized by fake news and the deep state, and that this builds on a longer standing narrative that he's developed throughout his presidency and beyond. Trump frequently repeats the idea that he is a victim, or these days that he's a martyr, especially after the assassination attempts, that he's a victim of powerful elites who's being unfairly attacked because he's fighting for real Americans, the real Americans who've been neglected by these same elites. If we go back and look at the Trump campaign and his early presidency, and then even after he leaves, Trump I don't think it's controversial at all that Trump has broken various rules and norms as he ran for president and during his presidency and then even after his presidency. When authorities such as the Robert Mueller special counsel and investigation when authorities sought to hold him accountable to the law or bring him into line with, various, democratic norms. He has regularly framed this as being victimized by the deep state or liberal media. And so this was, kind of a continuous pattern that then builds up the idea that, the liberal establishment are going to come after me any way they can. And this is something that he says in his something like this that he says in his stump speeches very often now, and that he has said for a while. And I recall in 2020, after the 2020 election or during the 2020 election, talking to Trump supporters who would say something like they never gave Trump a chance. And this was built on the perception that that it wasn't a perception that, he had come in and sought to do things that were extra legal. It was built on the perception that he came in and he tried to really fix things and they just came after him. The establishment came after him. The deep state came after him, right? The liberal establishment was always coming after him. So they never gave him a chance. They were always coming after him. And so the big lie fits this very same victim narrative very well, and it reinforces that the feeling that I think adds to that strong emotional connection, the feeling that Trump is being persecuted for standing up for us against against these dark powers.